Some miracles do not begin with a prayer. They begin with a frightened soul refusing to stop running. The first snow of December had settled quietly across the mountains outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, covering the winding highway in a blanket of white that reflected the pale morning light. The world felt almost silent beneath the cloudy sky, broken only by the distant whisper of pine trees swaying in the cold wind. Daniel Brooks, a 38-year-old former United States Marine now working as a park ranger, guided his pickup truck carefully along the icy road after finishing an overnight patrol through the national forest. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the highway the way years of military service had trained him to notice what others ignored. The heater hummed softly inside the cab, while an old country station played quietly through the speakers. It was supposed to be another ordinary winter morning. Then something small burst out of the trees. Daniel slammed on the brakes as a tiny German Shepherd puppy ran directly into the middle of the road, its black and tan fur soaked with melting snow, its small paws slipping across the frozen pavement. The frightened puppy did not run away from the truck. Instead, it stood directly in front of the headlights, barking with desperate urgency before turning toward the forest. Daniel frowned. "Easy there, little guy," he whispered as he climbed out into the freezing air. The puppy looked back at him with bright amber eyes filled not with fear, but with determination. Its chest rose rapidly with each exhausted breath. Snow clung to its whiskers, and one tiny paw trembled from the bitter cold. Daniel slowly crouched, extending one gloved hand. Most lost puppies would either retreat or cautiously approach. This one did neither. The puppy barked once, spun around, sprinted several yards toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back. When Daniel remained where he was, the puppy hurried back toward him, gently grabbed the cuff of his jacket with surprisingly careful teeth, tugged once, released it, then ran toward the woods again. Daniel watched in complete silence. Every instinct he had developed during years beside military working dogs stirred inside him. This was not random behavior. The puppy wanted something, or someone. He glanced at the empty highway stretching in both directions. No vehicles, no nearby homes. No footprints except the tiny tracks disappearing into fresh snow. "You are trying to show me something, aren't you?" he said quietly. The puppy answered with another urgent bark before disappearing between the towering pine trees. Daniel looked at his watch. He should have radioed in and headed home for sleep after a long shift. Instead, something deep inside him refused to drive away. He grabbed his flashlight, emergency medical pack, heavy winter gloves, and radio before locking the truck. The icy wind bit through his jacket as he stepped into the untouched snow. The puppy immediately reappeared a short distance ahead, as if it had been waiting to make sure he followed. It never wandered too far. Every few moments it paused, turned its head, and made certain Daniel was still behind it before continuing deeper into the silent forest. The farther they walked, the quieter the world became. Snow muffled every footstep. Frost covered broken branches like crystal. The air carried only the scent of pine, frozen earth, and something Daniel could not quite identify. Nearly half a mile from the highway, the puppy suddenly stopped beside a narrow clearing hidden between ancient evergreens. Its ears stood upright. Its breathing became faster. Instead of barking again, it stared toward a weathered log cabin barely visible beneath snow-covered branches. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. One shutter hung crooked against the wall. The front door stood slightly open, gently moving with each cold gust of wind. The puppy looked at Daniel one final time, then bolted toward the lonely cabin as a sound so faint it could almost have been carried by the wind reached his ears, leaving him frozen where he stood, unsure whether he had truly heard it or whether the mountain itself had just whispered for help. Daniel held his breath and listened again. The faint sound drifted through the cold air, so soft that it could have disappeared beneath the whisper of snow brushing against pine needles. Yet the puppy reacted instantly. Its ears lifted higher, and it rushed toward the weathered cabin with renewed urgency, stopping only once to make certain Daniel was following. The former Marine tightened his grip on the flashlight and carefully approached the open doorway. Years of experience had taught him never to rush into an unfamiliar place, but another lesson had stayed with him even longer. When someone needed help, every second mattered. The cabin was small and worn by countless winters. Dust rested on the windowsills, and the fireplace held only cold ashes. A wooden rocking chair sat quietly beside the stone hearth as though someone had stood up in a hurry and never returned. The silence inside felt strangely heavy. Daniel swept the flashlight slowly across the room. A small kitchen table stood against one wall, with an empty coffee mug resting beside a folded dish towel. Near the doorway lay a knitted baby hat, lightly dusted with snow that had drifted inside through the open door. Daniel bent down and picked it up. The fabric was still dry beneath the outer layer of frost. Someone had been here recently. The puppy hurried across the creaking floor and stopped beside an overturned stroller resting near the back of the cabin. Its tiny paws scratched anxiously against the wooden floorboards. Daniel moved closer. The stroller was empty. Inside rested two neatly folded baby blankets. He reached down and touched one with the back of his gloved hand. It was not frozen. It still held a trace of warmth. His pulse quickened. Whoever had wrapped these blankets had not been gone for very long. Beside the stroller sat two baby bottles. One was half full of formula that had not yet completely chilled. A small diaper bag leaned against the wall, its zipper partly open. Daniel looked inside. Extra diapers, baby wipes, tiny socks no larger than the palm of his hand. Everything suggested loving preparation, not abandonment. His eyes moved slowly around the cabin once more, searching for answers that refused to appear. No signs of struggle, no obvious explanation, only the unsettling feeling that a family had vanished within moments. The puppy let out a soft whine and darted toward the rear door. It paused, looked directly into Daniel's eyes, and then slipped outside into the falling snow. Daniel followed immediately. Fresh tracks stretched beyond the cabin into the forest, but the snowfall had already begun erasing their edges. The puppy lowered its nose close to the ground and moved carefully between towering evergreens, never hesitating, never losing confidence. Daniel kept pace despite the deep snow pressing against his boots with every step. His breathing grew heavier as the trail climbed gently uphill. The forest seemed untouched by the outside world. No voices, no engines, only the steady rhythm of wind moving through branches. After nearly 200 yards, the puppy suddenly stopped beside an enormous fallen pine tree whose massive roots had ripped part of the frozen earth open months before. It began digging frantically at the snow gathered beside the exposed roots, throwing white powder into the air with surprising determination. Daniel hurried forward, dropping to one knee beside the trembling puppy. At first he heard nothing except his own breathing. Then, beneath the wind, beneath the silence of the mountain, came the unmistakable sound again. It was not the cry of one infant. It was two. Daniel dropped to both knees beside the uprooted pine and brushed away the loose snow with his gloved hands. The tiny German shepherd was already digging with remarkable determination, its small paws moving so quickly that clumps of snow scattered across Daniel's jacket. The cries came again, weak but unmistakable, drifting from somewhere beneath the tangled mass of roots that had lifted a pocket of earth away from the frozen ground. Daniel switched off his flashlight for a moment and listened. The mountain fell silent. Then came another fragile cry, followed almost immediately by a second. His heartbeat quickened. "I hear you," he whispered into the cold air. "Hold on. I am coming." He pushed aside a broken branch and discovered a narrow hollow protected by the enormous roots. Snow had piled against the outside, forming a natural barrier against the bitter wind. The opening was barely large enough for a grown man to reach through. The puppy squeezed inside without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness. A soft whimper echoed back before the little dog emerged again, looking directly at Daniel as if urging him to hurry. Daniel carefully reached deeper into the hollow, his fingertips brushing against thick blankets tucked beneath layers of evergreen boughs. Someone had built this shelter with care. It was not random. It was a desperate attempt to protect precious lives from the freezing weather. He gently pulled the blankets toward him until two tiny faces appeared beneath wool caps. Their cheeks were pale from the cold, but both babies were breathing. One stirred weakly, releasing a faint cry that sounded almost too small for the enormous forest surrounding them. The second infant slowly opened sleepy eyes before curling closer to the warmth beside them. Daniel finally understood why the puppy had refused to leave. The little German shepherd had curled its own small body against the blankets inside the shelter, using every ounce of warmth it possessed to shield the babies from the relentless mountain air. Fine strands of black and tan fur clung to the fabric. Tiny paw prints covered the snow around the opening. This had not been a single visit. The puppy had returned here again and again. Daniel carefully lifted the first baby against his chest beneath his heavy ranger coat, allowing his own body heat to surround the child. Then he secured the second infant the same way, using an emergency thermal blanket from his medical pack. Both babies let out quiet cries, stronger now than before, and Daniel felt an overwhelming wave of relief. "You are fighters," he said softly. The puppy stood beside him, its tail giving one small wag before it looked back toward the forest. It did not celebrate. It remained alert, watching the trees with quiet intensity. Daniel reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Brooks. I have located 2 living infants approximately 1/2 mile north of Highway 47 near the abandoned Miller cabin. They are conscious and breathing. Request emergency medical response immediately. I will begin transport toward the access road." The reply crackled through the speaker, confirming that ambulances and deputies were already heading his way. Daniel rose carefully, holding both babies close while adjusting the blankets to block the freezing wind. The puppy trotted several feet ahead, occasionally glancing back as though guiding the safest path through the deep snow. Daniel took his first careful steps toward the highway, but after only a few yards the puppy suddenly stopped. Its ears stood straight, its nose lifted into the icy breeze. Then it turned away from the road and stared deeper into the silent forest, letting out one low, pleading bark that carried a message Daniel could not ignore. Someone else was still out there. Daniel stopped where he stood, the weight of the 2 infants against his chest suddenly feeling lighter than the decision pressing on his heart. The ambulance was coming. Every instinct told him to keep moving toward the road, but the little German shepherd remained perfectly still, staring into the dense forest with unwavering focus. The puppy let out another low bark, then looked back at Daniel with pleading eyes that seemed far older than its small body. Daniel had trusted military working dogs in places where a single hesitation could cost lives. He recognized that same certainty now. He pressed the radio button again. "Dispatch, I have the infants secure. I believe there may be another survivor deeper in the woods. I am marking my location and continuing approximately 100 yards east. Notify the rescue team to intercept me there." The dispatcher acknowledged immediately, her calm voice carrying reassurance through the crackling signal. Daniel adjusted the emergency blanket around the babies, making certain their tiny faces remained protected from the biting wind. One infant stretched a tiny hand against his jacket before settling peacefully once more. The other released a quiet sigh, comforted by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You are safe," Daniel whispered. "I promise." The puppy took off at a brisk pace, weaving through snow-covered pines with remarkable confidence. Daniel followed as carefully as he could, choosing every step to keep from slipping on hidden patches of ice. Fresh snow continued falling, soft flakes settling onto the blankets and melting almost instantly against the warmth beneath his coat. The forest seemed endless, each towering evergreen standing like a silent witness to whatever had happened here. After several minutes, the puppy slowed beside a narrow creek almost hidden beneath ice. It sniffed the frozen bank before crossing carefully over a fallen log. Daniel noticed something half buried near the water. He knelt and uncovered a small silver necklace attached to a delicate chain. Hanging from it was a heart-shaped pendant engraved with 2 tiny footprints and the words, "Our greatest blessings." He slipped the necklace into his jacket pocket, sensing it belonged to the family he was trying to save. The puppy was already moving again. This time it stopped beside a cluster of thick cedar trees where the wind barely reached the forest floor. Daniel scanned the area until his flashlight caught the edge of a dark winter coat resting against the base of a tree. His breath caught. A young woman lay curled beneath a layer of snow-covered branches, wrapped tightly in a heavy blanket that had shielded her from the worst of the weather. Her face was pale with exhaustion, and her breathing was slow but steady. One hand remained stretched toward the direction of the hidden shelter where the babies had been found, as though even in her final moments of strength she had refused to let go of them. Daniel gently knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. It was faint but present. Relief washed over him. "You did everything you could," he said quietly. Her eyelids fluttered slightly at the sound of his voice. For a brief second her lips moved. Barely louder than the falling snow, one word escaped. Ranger. Daniel leaned closer. She slowly turned her eyes toward the little German shepherd standing faithfully beside him. A single tear slipped down her cheek as a tired smile appeared. Rex, she whispered with all the gratitude she had left. The puppy immediately stepped forward, resting its tiny head gently against her gloved hand. And for the first time since Daniel had met him, the determined little dog finally allowed himself to close his eyes for just one quiet moment. Daniel pressed the emergency button on his radio once more, his voice calm despite the urgency surrounding him. Dispatch, I have located an adult female. She is alive, but severely exhausted. I need the rescue team redirected immediately to my updated coordinates. The response came without hesitation. Search and rescue units were less than 10 minutes away. Daniel looked down at the young woman as she struggled to keep her eyes open. The tiny German shepherd remained beside her, gently pressing against her shoulder as though lending her the last bit of strength he had left. Daniel carefully removed another thermal blanket from his medical pack and wrapped it around her before checking her pulse again. It remained weak, but steady. Stay with us, he said softly. Your babies are safe. At those words, her breathing caught for a moment. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes before quietly slipping across her chilled cheeks. She tried to speak, but exhaustion stole the words before they reached her lips. Instead, she managed the smallest nod. The puppy lifted his head immediately, watching her face with complete attention. Daniel had seen loyalty before. He had witnessed military dogs refuse to leave injured soldiers during overseas deployments. Yet there was something different here. This tiny German shepherd had not acted from training alone. Every choice had come from devotion. Within minutes, the distant sound of helicopter blades echoed across the mountains, growing louder with every passing second. Soon afterward, flashing emergency lights flickered through the trees as rescue crews pushed carefully through the deep snow, carrying medical equipment and stretchers. Paramedics immediately surrounded the young mother, while another team gently examined the twins. One experienced nurse smiled with visible relief after listening to the baby's breathing. Their temperatures are improving, she said. Whoever protected them bought them precious time. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the little German shepherd sitting quietly beside the stretcher. The puppy seemed almost confused by the attention. His ears lowered slightly as one paramedic knelt to check his small paws. Tiny patches of ice clung between his pads, and his fur remained damp from hours spent moving through snow. Despite obvious fatigue, he never looked away from the mother being lifted onto the rescue sled. As the helicopter prepared for departure, Daniel climbed aboard beside the twins while another medical crew secured the young woman. The puppy hesitated only briefly before leaping into the aircraft without being asked, settling near the stretcher with his head resting gently against the blanket covering her hand. No one told him to move. No one had the heart to separate them. During the short flight to Mercy Regional Hospital, the cabin remained filled with the steady rhythm of medical monitors and the deep hum of the helicopter engine. Daniel watched as one of the infants slowly wrapped tiny fingers around his thumb. The simple gesture carried more hope than any words could have offered. Across from him, the mother briefly opened her eyes again. Her gaze searched the cabin until it found the puppy. A faint smile appeared. She whispered only one sentence before drifting back to sleep. He never gave up on us. Daniel looked at the little German shepherd, who finally allowed his tired body to relax against the floor of the aircraft. His breathing slowed, but his ears still twitched each time the babies made the smallest sound. As Mercy Regional Hospital came into view beneath the morning sky, Daniel realized the rescue was only beginning. The mountain had surrendered its survivors, but the unanswered questions had followed them all the way home. The automatic doors of Mercy Regional Hospital slid open as the rescue team rushed inside, carrying with them far more than patience. They carried a story no one could yet explain. Nurses moved quickly but calmly, guiding the twins into the neonatal unit, while another medical team wheeled the young mother toward the emergency department. Daniel remained close enough to answer questions, but far enough to let the professionals do their work. The little German shepherd followed without making a sound. His tiny paws clicked softly across the polished floor until a nurse gently stopped him outside the treatment room. The puppy sat immediately, never resisting, never taking his eyes off the closed door. Daniel lowered himself onto the chair beside him. "You have done enough," he said quietly. The puppy rested his head against Daniel's boot, but refused to sleep. Nearly an hour passed before Dr. Allison Pierce stepped into the waiting area, removing her gloves with a tired but relieved smile. "The twins are stable," she said. "They are cold and dehydrated, but they are responding well. Their mother is also recovering. She is exhausted, but we expect her to make a full recovery." Daniel released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Can she tell us what happened?" he asked. "Not yet," the doctor replied. "She drifted in and out of consciousness during treatment. She keeps asking whether her babies are safe. Every time we reassure her, she says the same name." Daniel glanced toward the puppy. "Rex." The doctor nodded. "She repeats it over and over." At that exact moment, the puppy lifted his head, his ears standing alert as though he had heard his own name through the hospital walls. A few minutes later, a county sheriff entered the waiting area carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside rested the silver heart-shaped necklace Daniel had found beside the frozen creek. "Our deputies searched the cabin after the rescue," the sheriff explained. "We also found a driver's license inside the diaper bag." He removed a small notepad and continued. "Her name is Sarah Miller, 29 years old. No criminal history. Local address in Cedar Ridge." Daniel quietly accepted the information. None of it answered the question that mattered most. How did she end up alone in the mountains with newborn twins? The sheriff slowly shook his head. "We do not know yet. Her vehicle was discovered several miles away after sliding off a Forest Service road during the storm. There are no signs anyone intended to harm her. Right now, everything points toward a tragic accident made worse by the blizzard." Daniel looked through the window into the neonatal unit, where two tiny bassinets rested beneath warm lights. The twins slept peacefully for the first time since he had found them. Nurses moved carefully around them, adjusting blankets and monitoring quiet machines that now sounded more comforting than frightening. Beside him, the puppy finally closed his eyes for several seconds before suddenly lifting his nose toward the hallway. His tail gave one gentle sweep against the floor. Daniel followed his gaze. A nurse was slowly guiding a wheelchair toward them. Wrapped in warm blankets, Sarah looked exhausted but stronger than before. Her eyes searched the waiting area until they found the little German shepherd. Tears immediately filled them. Without speaking, she reached out a trembling hand. Rex hurried forward as gently as if he understood she was still healing. He rested his small head against her fingers, and Sarah smiled through quiet tears. Then she looked at Daniel with gratitude deeper than words. "There is something you deserve to know," she whispered. "Rex did not just save us today. He has been trying to save us since yesterday morning." Sarah waited until a nurse finished adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before speaking again. Her voice was quiet, weakened by exhaustion, yet every word carried the unmistakable weight of memory. Daniel pulled a chair closer while the little German shepherd settled at her feet, looking up at her with calm amber eyes that never seemed to leave her face for long. "Yesterday morning," Sarah began, "the weather forecast promised only light snow. I thought I had enough time to drive to my parents' cabin before the storm arrived. Emma and Noah had finally fallen asleep, and Rex insisted on climbing into the back seat beside them. He had never done that before." She paused as though replaying every mile in her mind. "About 15 miles from the cabin, the snow became so heavy I could barely see the road. A fallen tree forced me onto an old Forest Service trail that I thought would reconnect with the highway. Instead, my car slid into a shallow ditch. It was not a terrible crash. The vehicle simply refused to move." Daniel listened without interrupting. Outside the hospital window, fresh snow continued drifting across the parking lot, reminding everyone how quickly winter could change an ordinary day. "There was no cell service," Sarah continued. "I stayed inside for hours, hoping another driver would come. None did. As the temperature kept dropping, I knew I could not leave the babies in the car overnight. I remembered the abandoned ranger cabin less than a mile away. I packed everything I could carry, wrapped the twins in blankets, and walked." She closed her eyes briefly before continuing. "We reached the cabin just before sunset. I believed we would be safe there until morning." Her fingers gently rested on Rex's head. But the storm became worse than anyone expected. Snow covered the trail we had used. Every direction looked exactly the same. Daniel nodded slowly. He had seen mountain weather erase familiar landscapes within minutes. Sarah drew a careful breath. Late that night, I realized our supplies would not last if no one found us. I tried to leave several times, but every path disappeared into blowing snow. Each time I returned, Rex met me at the door as though begging me not to keep searching alone. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they carried gratitude rather than fear. Then something happened that I still cannot fully explain. Before sunrise, Rex suddenly stood up, walked to the babies, gently touched each blanket with his nose, and looked at me. It was almost as if he had made a decision. She smiled faintly through the emotion. I remembered the simple game I had taught him at home. Whenever he found me after I hid somewhere in the backyard, I always rewarded him. I never imagined it would matter someday. I knelt beside him, held his face in my hands, and whispered, "Go find help, Rex. Bring someone back." Daniel glanced at the puppy in quiet disbelief. Rex simply rested his chin against Sarah's knee, completely unaware that every person in the room was looking at him with growing admiration. "He hesitated only for a second," Sarah whispered. "Then he ran into the storm." Hours passed, and I kept wondering if I had asked too much of such a little dog. I held on because I believed that if Rex was still searching, then I had to keep believing too. When I could no longer stay awake, the last thing I remember was praying that someone would understand what he was trying to say. Then I opened my eyes today and saw both of you standing beside me. That is when I knew he had never stopped running until he found the right person. The following morning, sunlight filtered softly through the windows of Mercy Regional Hospital, painting warm streaks of gold across the quiet hallway. For the first time since the rescue, the atmosphere felt peaceful instead of uncertain. Emma and Noah rested comfortably in neighboring bassinets, their tiny hands occasionally reaching toward the blankets wrapped around them. Nurses smiled each time they entered the room because the twins had grown stronger through the night. Sarah remained under observation, but the color had begun returning to her face, and her voice carried more strength with every conversation. Daniel stopped by before beginning his afternoon shift, carrying nothing more than a cup of coffee and the quiet hope that everyone inside the room was truly healing. As he stepped through the doorway, he found Rex lying beside Sarah's bed, asleep for what appeared to be the first time in nearly 2 days. His little paws twitched gently, as though he were still running through fresh snow inside a dream. Sarah smiled when she noticed Daniel watching him. "He finally believes we are safe," she said softly. Daniel nodded. He earned the rest. A gentle knock interrupted the moment as Sheriff Tom Henderson entered carrying a small cardboard evidence box. "We finished collecting the family's belongings from the cabin and the vehicle," he explained. "Most of it survived the storm." He carefully placed the box on the bedside table. Sarah slowly opened it. Inside were the twins' baby books, a few family photographs, the diaper bag, several warm clothes, and a worn blue collar with a tiny brass tag attached. Daniel immediately recognized it. Rex had not been wearing a collar when he found him on the highway. Sarah picked it up carefully, her fingers tracing the faded leather before fastening it gently around the puppy's neck without waking him. The small brass tag caught the morning sunlight. Daniel leaned closer and quietly read the simple engraving. "My name is Rex. If I am lost, please help me find my family." No reward mentioned. No address written beneath it. Only those few words. Daniel looked down at the sleeping puppy and suddenly understood that the tag had never really been about someone finding Rex. It had always been about Rex finding the people who needed him most. Sheriff Henderson smiled quietly. "One of my deputies found the collar near the cabin door. It probably slipped off while he kept running back and forth through the woods." Sarah nodded. "He was always growing so fast that I kept forgetting to tighten it." Everyone laughed softly, the kind of gentle laughter that follows relief after long hours of fear. Even Rex lifted one ear without opening his eyes, as though he recognized happiness in their voices. Later that afternoon, a nurse rolled the twins into Sarah's room for the first time since the rescue. Emma stirred first, making a tiny coo that immediately caught Rex's attention. The puppy slowly stood, stretched his tired little body, and carefully approached the bassinets. He sniffed each baby gently before settling down exactly between them, resting his chin on the edge of the blankets. Noah responded by wrapping tiny fingers around one strand of Rex's soft fur without pulling. The puppy remained perfectly still, watching the newborn with patient eyes filled with quiet trust. Daniel stood near the window, looking at the scene in complete silence. He had witnessed medals awarded, missions completed, and lives saved under impossible circumstances. Yet somehow this simple moment felt greater than all of them. No applause echoed through the room. No cameras waited outside the door. Only a recovering mother, two sleeping babies, a tiny German shepherd who had refused to surrender, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the smallest heart carried enough courage to lead an entire family home. News travels differently through a small mountain town. It does not arrive with fanfare or flashing headlines. It moves quietly from one grateful heart to another until suddenly everyone seems to know the same remarkable story. 3 days after the rescue, the waiting room at Mercy Regional Hospital held more visitors than usual. Local firefighters stopped by before their shifts. Sheriff's deputies quietly checked on the twins during lunch breaks. Nurses from departments that had never met Sarah found reasons to walk past the neonatal unit just to smile at the little family that had reminded everyone why they chose careers built on compassion. Daniel arrived after finishing his morning patrol carrying a small stuffed bear that one of the volunteers at the ranger station had knitted for the twins. He hesitated outside the room, unsure whether he should interrupt, but Sarah noticed him through the glass and waved him inside with a warm smile. Emma and Noah were awake, their tiny eyes wandering curiously around the softly lit room while Rex rested beneath the window, watching every movement with calm attention. The puppy had recovered quickly after several proper meals and long hours of uninterrupted sleep, yet he never wandered far from the bassinets. It had quietly become his favorite place in the world. Sarah accepted the little bear with grateful eyes. "They already have more gifts than I know what to do with," she laughed softly. Daniel looked around and realized she was right. Hand-sewn blankets rested on a nearby chair. A basket of baby supplies filled one corner of the room. Handmade cards covered the windowsill, each carrying messages from neighbors who had never even met the family before. One card simply read, "Welcome home." Another said, "Thank you, Rex, for reminding us that hope still walks beside us." Daniel smiled as the puppy slowly wandered over to investigate the growing pile of gifts. A volunteer photographer from the local newspaper quietly stepped into the room after receiving permission from Sarah. "We would love one family photograph," she explained. "Not for headlines, just something our community can remember." Sarah nodded. Daniel instinctively stepped back, believing the moment belonged only to the mother and her children, but Sarah gently stopped him. "You are part of this story too," she said. "Please stay." Before Daniel could answer, Rex trotted across the room and sat directly beside his boots, looking up with patient expectation. Everyone laughed quietly. The photographer smiled. "I think he already decided where everyone belongs." Daniel reluctantly took his place beside the hospital bed. Sarah cradled Emma while a nurse carefully placed Noah beside her. Rex sat proudly at the foot of the bed, his small blue collar catching the afternoon sunlight. Just before the camera shutter clicked, Emma stretched one tiny hand toward the puppy, and Rex gently leaned forward until her fingers rested against the soft fur between his ears. The room fell completely silent for that single beautiful second. Click. The photograph captured more than faces. It preserved gratitude itself. Later that evening, after the visitors had gone home and the hospital hallways grew quiet again, Daniel walked past the room one final time before leaving. Through the partially opened door, he saw Sarah asleep with peaceful confidence for the first time since the storm. The twins rested quietly nearby. Rex remained awake beneath the window, keeping his silent watch. As Daniel turned to leave, the puppy looked toward him and gave one slow wag of his tail. It was not a request to stay. It was simply the quiet acknowledgement shared between two guardians who understood that some promises no longer needed words. 5 days later, the hospital felt different. The emergency had faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of recovery that often went unnoticed by people rushing through the hallways. Outside, the last traces of the storm melted beneath a bright Colorado sun, sending thin streams of water across the sidewalks. Inside Mercy Regional Hospital, life continued one patient at a time, yet one small room still drew gentle smiles from everyone who passed. Emma and Noah had gained strength every day. Their tiny cries were louder now, their eyes stayed open longer, and they seemed fascinated by the light dancing across the ceiling each morning. Sarah had recovered enough to walk slowly through the maternity wing with a nurse beside her, and each careful step reminded her how close she had come to losing everything she loved. Rex followed faithfully at her side, his blue collar softly jingling with every step, stopping whenever she stopped, waiting whenever she needed to rest. Daniel visited whenever his ranger schedule allowed. He never stayed long. Sometimes he brought fresh coffee for Sarah. Other times he simply stood outside the nursery window, watching the twins sleep before quietly heading back to work. He never expected gratitude. Seeing the family together was enough. That afternoon, Dr. Allison Pierce entered Sarah's room carrying a clipboard and an encouraging smile. "If everything continues like this," she said, "I believe all three of you can go home tomorrow." Sarah covered her mouth as tears immediately filled her eyes. Home. The word suddenly felt like a miracle instead of an ordinary place. She looked down at Rex, who tilted his head as though he recognized the happiness in her voice. Daniel happened to arrive just as the news was shared. Sarah laughed through happy tears. "Looks like you came at the perfect moment." Daniel smiled warmly. "I think somebody else deserves the credit." He nodded toward the puppy, who had already wandered over to the bassinets. Emma reached out with surprising confidence, gently resting her tiny hand against Rex's shoulder. Noah responded with a sleepy smile that made every nurse nearby pause for a moment. Even Dr. Pierce quietly admitted she had never seen such a peaceful connection between newborn children and such a young dog. Before leaving, the doctor handed Sarah a small envelope. "Our staff wanted you to have this." Inside was the family photograph taken several days earlier. Beneath it, every member of the emergency department had signed their names alongside one simple sentence. "Some families are built by birth. Others are brought together by courage." Sarah held the photograph against her heart. Daniel looked at the image for a long moment. He noticed details he had missed before. The way Rex sat proudly between everyone. The way both babies seemed naturally turned toward him. The quiet expression on Sarah's face after finally knowing her children were safe. Even his own tired smile looked different from the man who had driven through the mountains that morning expecting nothing unusual. Sheriff Tom Henderson stopped by later with one final update. The damaged vehicle had been recovered, insurance paperwork was complete, and volunteers from Cedar Ridge had already repaired the small cabin trail, so no family would become stranded there again. Sometimes an entire community changed because one frightened puppy refused to stop asking for help. As evening settled outside the hospital windows, Daniel prepared to leave once more. Before he reached the door, Rex quietly walked over and gently placed one tiny paw against Daniel's boot. Neither of them moved for several seconds. No commands were spoken. No tricks were performed. It was simply the silent gratitude of one guardian recognizing another. Daniel knelt, scratched gently behind the puppy's ears, and whispered, "You found your family, little buddy." Rex looked back towards Sarah, Emma, and Noah, then returned his gaze to Daniel with calm amber eyes that seemed to answer without making a sound. They had all found one. I cannot accurately continue with Part 11 because the necessary context, especially the content of Part 10, the established characters, and the current point in the timeline, is not present in this conversation. Inventing those details would break your requirement to keep the characters, setting, and timeline fully consistent. I cannot produce a valid Part 12 that is consistent with Parts 10 and 11 because those story sections are not available in this conversation. Doing so would require inventing characters, events, and timeline details, which would violate your requirement that the continuation remain fully consistent. I cannot truthfully write a continuation of Part 13 that is consistent with Parts 10 to 12 because those parts are not present in this conversation. Generating one would require inventing prior events, characters, and timeline details, which would contradict your explicit requirement to maintain continuity.